What I heard, justice in the Philippines really only depends on your last name and how much money you have.
Sometimes.
I heard in the Philippines, we don't have a mafia problem because the police and the government are the mafia.
Apples.
Apples. I have so many questions about that answer.
Yeah.
Court cases in the Philippines can drag on for decades because the wealthy can use it to delay justice.
Digitalization.
If you're part of a political dynasty, the consequences of the law doesn't necessarily apply to you.
Entitlement.
It's estimated that approximately 30% of the government budget is expected to go to political kickback.
Contractors.
In the Philippines, most judges can be paid off. It's just a matter of naming the right price.
Corruption.
Yes. You said the C word. You said the C word.
Today, we sit down with Assistant Ombudsman Mico Clavano, previously the spokesperson of the Department of Justice. Mico has become one of the most recognized voices in government for pushing a stronger, more accountable justice system. He's known for speaking out about the need for better investigation, better prosecutors, and a justice system people can trust. In this episode, he gives us a rare look at what's really happening inside these institutions, talks openly about politics and major cases, and answers the big question: can government truly be held accountable in today's justice system? Stay tuned.
Now, Mico, I'm going to give you a chance to debunk what I just said and give you a chance to explain more thoroughly what Filipinos need to know. So the first thing I asked you was, does the justice system depend on your last name and how much money you have?
We have this obsession, I think, with celebrity status and people who are very influential in society. And oftentimes, people in government, they are mesmerized or they are starstruck by celebrities or people of influence who come into contact with the justice system. And, it highlights a very human thing, especially Filipinos. When they want to be more pleasant, they want to put more attention and focus to the things that they feel are relevant to their lives. And I'm not trying to generalize, obviously. It's just something that is very human, and especially here in the Philippine context.
So they tend to get a pass here because of it's a cultural issue that we tend to give people in high status or celebrities a pass. But I'm thinking, I ever see these movies in the States where you'll see the prosecutor and the district attorney, and they'll look at a celebrity and they'll be like, oh my God, this guy did something wrong. We're going to make an example out of them. Do you guys think the same way?
Absolutely. There are certain cases that should be highlighted, especially when it's a open and shut case where it's very important that you make an example out of these people. For example, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, or the BIR, every year, they go after celebrities, or they go after these large taxpayers so that they make an example of people before the deadline of taxes, so that people are more aware that the deadline is coming and there are no exceptions.
So it's like this enforcement through fear, or setting an example or creating the fear so that, because it's too difficult to enforce across the board, right? So just like the law, you want to set prime examples so that more people don't break the law, because how can it's such a huge thing to be able to enforce all these cases.
Exactly. I mean, going back to the question, it's kind of a double-edged sword if you're a celebrity or somebody with influence, because on the one hand, you could get special treatment because of your stature. But at the same time, if people in government see that you could be made an example of, then there's really no getting out of it. But I mean, obviously, I wish and I hope that, one day we could be in a system where nobody has any special treatment. We don't have to make examples out of people. But I guess it's really just human nature. And I think it's the same way in other jurisdictions as well. So that some people are made examples of, and sometimes, on the other hand, because of your celebrity status, you tend to get away with more. So, it's a double-edged sword. And I really think that with some of the reforms that we're trying to put in, that, we kind of are able to even out the playing field.
If you're enjoying this conversation, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We want to bring more honest and meaningful conversations like this to you. Also, leave a comment. Your feedback helps to shape this channel, and let me know who you want me to interview and what questions you want to ask. Now back to the video.
Now, I said earlier, it's common thinking that we don't have a mafia problem in the Philippines because the government and the police is the mafia. I won't name names, but you hear stories about certain politicians doing very mafioso stuff.
Well, to that, I said apples,
Yeah.
right? And I wanted to say apples because I couldn't say bad apples. Because that's too hard.
Yeah.
So when you say mafia, it presupposes that the organization is meant to do bad things,
Mhm.
right? When you say mafia, it's a
Store,
crime.
racketeering, you name it.
You name it, they do it.
Right.
Murder, money
Murder.
laundering. And so when you say mafia, the ultimate purpose of the organization is to do something illegal. But in my opinion, the government's purpose is supposed to do good for the people. It's a way to afford protection to the citizens, to build, to provide services, to alleviate poverty. So when you say mafia, I don't think it really can jive with the purpose of government, although there are certain bad apples and certain bad actors in government that use the very resources that are supposed to be for the benefit of the people, and they tend to abuse it for their own personal gain.
Of course, yeah.
So in that sense, if you have a few bad apples in a lot of the departments and a lot of these agencies working together to get one up on the Filipino people, then it sort of has the makings of
Organized crime.
organized crime. Exactly. But to generalize that the government itself is the mafia might be an overreach. But there are definitely bad apples in each organization that may work together to form some sort of criminal syndicate.
Do you remember did you watch Narcos?
Yes. Just the first season.
So the whole, you can see the cartels gaining so much power at some point. Where do they go? They turn to politics.
For protection.
Whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
So like when you get to a certain stage of like power and money,
Mhm.
politics is kind of like the ultimate arena for that,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sucks that that's the way it's perceived now. Obviously, power, when put in the wrong hands, could yield a lot of evil, right? But if you put in the right hands and you have the right attitude, you have the right perspective, then you use it for the way it's supposed to be used.
Yeah, this is a good one. We'll go more into this later because the DOJ is a big part to balancing that
Mhm.
equation. But we'll get into what the DOJ does in a little bit. But let's go back to these debunking some of these conceptions. Court cases drag on for decades because the wealthy can just keep delaying justice.
What did I say there? Did I say inefficiency? Was it inefficiency?
Is it corruption?
Oh, yes.
There's a C word.
Corruption. With that question, I answered corruption. And that goes hand in hand with the inefficiencies in our justice system. And like I mentioned before, there are bad apples. And even in the judiciary, there are bad apples, right? And a lot of the times with these bad apples, you just name a price and somehow they're able to do things that you want them to do.
Right.
Of course, I don't, again, want to generalize. And that's why we have what is called the Judicial Integrity Board, which is supposed to be the body that protects against bribery and corruption in the judiciary. But it happens everywhere, even outside of the judiciary. When you delay processes, when you do things so that you benefit or you put more advantage on one side than the other, it's really a result of, I guess, the integrity of the institution being eroded by certain people. And that's why it gives off the impression that you can pay off anybody in the judiciary, you can pay off anybody in the prosecution office. But really, it's just those bad apples and those bad actors ruining the reputation of a whole institution.
Right.
So for me, yes, there are inefficiencies which you can address by certain reforms, especially digitalization, right? So that you are sure that you stick to the proper time periods provided for under the law.
Okay. So the next one, I said, most judges can be paid off. It's just really a matter of naming the right price. What did you say, Dua?
Maybe that was when I said corruption. Yeah. Well, obviously it's wrong.
Okay.
To be able to buy justice goes against every principle of what justice is,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Because if you're able to pay for it, it becomes a commodity. And justice is not a commodity. It's something intangible that is supposed to support a whole society. Because if you don't have the certainty of punishment to those wrongdoers, and you're not able to hold people accountable for the things they've done wrong, then it goes beyond the justice system. It goes into the economy. It goes into the disparity in social structures.
And if there is no integrity in the justice system, nothing will work. That's where everything fails.
Exactly. It's really the anchor that holds a lot of things in the country together. Because investors, for example, from all over the world will not come to the Philippines if they don't know or they can't predict certain outcomes.
Right.
So if they enter into a contract, but that contract is easily violated without any repercussions, without consequences, why come?
Exactly.
Right?
Nothing would work.
Nothing will work.
Everything would fall apart.
Exactly. And especially if they, when foreigners come in, they feel like they don't get a fair shake in the justice system. And I know that's prevalent because I've talked to a lot of foreigners, and that's exactly there you go. And they've obviously mentioned that they feel like they're the away team coming into the home court of the Filipinos. And we have this saying, it's called Lutong Macau. And it means you cook your food in your own oil. So it's like, it's as if to say that you control everything about the justice system if you're a Filipino. At least that's the impression that they give the foreigners. If you come in and you mess with me, I have everything here. You're the outsider.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And to a certain extent, that's not good either for business.
No. But is there truth behind that? Is there truth behind that misperception or that perception?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Because there's a culture of
family,
right? And when you see a Filipino abroad, for example, you guys could be best buds after a day because Filipinos long for companionship and we're very family oriented.
Very tribal too.
Very tribal. And so, you would obviously side with your fellow Filipino, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It keeps our societal fiber very tight.
It does.
And it's a great thing. It's a great thing that we're family oriented. But in the context of justice, it takes on a different tone, especially if you use it to abuse foreigners' involvement in the Philippines.
Do you think that cultural aspect of the tribalism, the family ties, the close-knit, do you think that bleeds too much into the justice system here in the Philippines?
Well, not necessarily. Not all the time. Maybe in some cases. Yes, that's true. Actually, us in the DOJ, we have this policy where we don't like meddling in family disputes. Because a lot of the time, for example, families fight over property, money, and whatnot, right? And a lot of the times, it could actually be solved in the civil courts or mediation. If you have the right third person mediating between the two sides of the family, you can usually overcome that. But some people, they bring it to the DOJ with a criminal case as against their own family member. And that's what we don't like. We don't like being weaponized by families who are going against each other. Mainly because we know that culturally, we're not like that. So it became a policy of the DOJ not to meddle in family disputes.
Right. Okay, so the next one I asked you, if you're a politician or if you're part of a political dynasty, the consequences of the law doesn't necessarily apply to you. And you had an interesting remark about this. Tell us about what you think about that conception, that perception.
Yeah. Well, given the context of the question, you delve into like these political dynasties and families who have been in the political scene for a very long time. And sometimes it breeds some sort of entitlement because as children of wealthy, influential, powerful people, you have it easy from the get-go. Everything is spoon-fed. Everything is on a silver platter for you from the time you're born. And so you build that entitlement. And so whenever you deal with people, you expect them to treat you the way they treat your father, uncle, whoever is in politics, whoever is powerful. And that's very dangerous. And so you see, with these political dynasties, it's hard for us to vote the right people in place because they rely on their last names
Mhm.
purely.
Mhm.
Some, I'm not saying all. And the hope is that instead of voting people for the last name, vote them for their credentials. Vote
Their
them
merits. Yeah.
for their merits. It doesn't matter then if they have the same last name as their father or uncle or whoever. But as long as they're able to provide value themselves and not just because of their father or whoever is in politics, then I don't mind. I mean, it might not be the same perspective for everybody, but for me, as long as the son or daughter, whoever is running for politics as a result of, a political dynasty, if they can offer much more value than their predecessors, why not put them in position?
But what about the perception that they're so powerful
Mhm.
and they become so powerful in a local region that, they pretty much dictate the law, or the law doesn't apply to them because they're pretty much untouchable? Is there truth behind that, and is that a system problem?
There is truth behind that, and we call that the culture of impunity, because people think they are above the law and that the law does not apply to them. But that's exactly what we have to make an example out of, because if you let that go, then it obviously strengthens that type of culture. If you muster enough courage to go against the grain and go after these people who feel that they're above the law, then, like as we said earlier, it kind of destroys that whole cycle.
Right. Okay, so the next one, I said there is an estimate of approximately 30%. The number is arbitrary,
Mhm.
but a percentage of the government budget is set aside for political kickback. Whether it's legal or not, that is a perception that this is a standard of how things work here. What do you have to say to that?
The president came out recently in the State of the Nation address and said that essentially exposed these flood control projects as a way for politicians to get kickbacks. And recently, after the sauna, he exposed 15 contractors that bagged 20% of all flood control projects in the whole country. 5 of them were found to have had projects in all regions of the Philippines. And what that says is, one, the president has had enough of this type of problem. But two, it acknowledges a very real thing here in
Right.
the country where kickbacks have become the norm. So what happens usually is the contractors give back a certain amount, whether that be 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever it is. But they give that back to the person who is responsible for getting them the contract. And that's wasted money for me, because whatever that percentage is could have been used in making the project a lot better in terms of quality. Because you have ghost projects on the one hand, and you have substandard projects on the other hand. And sometimes I don't even know what's worse. Because on the one hand, if you have ghost projects, then that's straight up, that's the worst form of corruption, because you're literally stealing people's money. But on the other hand, if you try to implement something, but you don't do it well by using substandard stuff,
Right.
then public safety is compromised.
And then there's a whole issue of removing that problem.
Yes, but even worse than that, people could die.
Yeah.
Because the bridge could collapse, the roads could crack. There's, that little barrier by the side of the road
Mhm.
where people are supposed to be able to hit and stay on the road. If those are flimsy, then they fall out. So I don't even know what's worse. Obviously, 2 different criteria. One, for ghost projects, it's the worst type of corruption. But on the other hand, if you have substandard projects, you're jeopardizing lives of Filipinos.
I mean, you think about how rooted this problem is. And it sounds like it's such a standard of how things work. And you're right. If I was a contractor and I was a more experienced contractor bidding for a government project that is less and more efficient at a lesser price, and the government still chooses somebody else for much more, and the work is substandard, I mean, this just ultimately hurts the public, right?
No, it does.
Big time.
And it erodes the trust that people have in our politicians, people who are supposed to implement these projects for the betterment of society. You know what I mean? Like, people are no longer gonna trust anything we do. And that's the
Right.
problem, because there are so many brilliant people in government and people who are ideal and optimistic enough to want to get things done. But because there are these silly practices and there are people who still involve themselves in these types of rackets, then it erodes the credibility of everybody in government. And so no matter what you do, no matter how much good you want for the country, nobody's going to believe you.
You're absolutely right. This is going to erode the fabric of society. And there needs to be some sort of balance to all of this. And so I imagine the justice system and the Department of Justice is a big part of the equation of balancing that out to kind of make sure that our society doesn't just fall through the hole. Can you talk a little bit more and explain to us? A lot of people don't understand what the Department of Justice is and what it does. Can you break it down for us?
Well, first misconception with the DOJ is that we are the courts,
Right.
which is not the case. A lot of people confuse the Department of Justice with the Supreme Court. And so the Department of Justice is actually in the executive branch, while the Supreme Court is the judiciary.
Right.
Yeah, the judicial branch, right? And so we don't decide on court cases. We actually are a party to the court cases as prosecutors in criminal cases. And the Department of Justice is actually the mother department of 10 attached agencies, including the NBI, which is the FBI of the Philippines, the premier law enforcement agencies. We have the Office of the Solicitor General, where I used to work, actually. We have the LRA, the Land Registration Authority.
That's an odd one. Later.
We have the Bureau of Immigration under us. We also have the Bureau of Corrections, the Office of the Government Corporate Counsel, the Office of the Alternate Dispute Resolution. We also have the Board of Pardon and Paroles, the Parole and Probation Authority, and the National Prosecution Service. Yeah.
It sounds, based on those departments, that really you guys are like the strong arm of the, I guess the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you enforce the law, basically.
Right.
You can prosecute and enforce the law. You can put them into correction facility. You can stop them from immigrating or to, I guess, escaping the country. And then, yeah, so it sounds like everything is kind of surrounded by that. But then you have the Land Registry Authority, which I don't know how that ties into.
The Land Registration Authority, people think it's just an administrative body where it's just the repository of all the titles in the country. But really, it's a legal process that you need to undergo with the LRA, which is why it's under the Department of Justice. It's a legal process. And as such, given the importance and how crucial land titles are, it becomes the backbone, right? It becomes the backbone of the country. Because if you have a stable land system, it provides for a stable base for all other economic transactions to happen. So I think that was the wisdom behind putting the LRA under the Department of Justice.
Now, you talked about the departments. Talk about the functions, the basic functions of the Department of Justice.
Well, we as the mother department coordinate the efforts of the attached agencies. So, for example, the Bureau of Immigration, the DOJ has complete supervision and control over immigration because it's a matter of national security. The people that come in and out of the country is very much intertwined with our national security, because this is how you screen basically who gets to come in and participate in our society and those who can't. So this is something that is very important, especially today when we talk about the global trend of human trafficking and scam hubs. So that's the Bureau of Immigration, right? And to be able to tie that up, let's take, for example, human trafficking, right? And let's see how it interacts with the rest of the agencies. So immigration is first touch. They see people coming in and out of the country who may or may not be victims of trafficking. But if they are determined to have been victimized, then we need to prosecute the perpetrators. Once successfully prosecuted, they now enter into the correction system. Once they're in the correction system, there's good conduct time allowances, there's the parole system, the probation system, and those are the other two, right? And then the others are more for, I guess, government. The OSG, for example, is the government's lawyer. So anytime that there's a case against or for the country or any of its agencies or departments, the OSG is the one that shows up in court and litigates on behalf of the government. And that's so that, all these departments and agencies can concentrate and focus on what they actually do, and we just have a separate agency handle all the court cases.
Gotcha.
It becomes more efficient that way.
So what is your main mission behind the DOJ? Can you name like maybe 1, 2, or 3 main primary objective?
I mean, obviously, it's access to justice, first and foremost, because of the way our country has become in terms of, the disparity between the rich and the poor. Like you alluded to in your questions earlier, it seems as though the justice system is there for the rich, the influential, the powerful. But really, it's supposed to apply to everybody equally. That's why you have Lady Justice with the blindfold, right?
The balance.
With the balance thing. Yeah.
It's supposed to be balanced.
It's supposed to be balanced, and it's supposed to be blind, no matter the race, the gender, the stature in life. That's not supposed to matter. And so one of the advocacies of the DOJ now is being able to bring the justice system closer to the people and making them aware of their rights and how to use the justice system properly.
Do you see the need for reform with the current system as it is with the DOJ?
A lot. I think a lot of reforms are due. As my boss always says, the deadline is always yesterday.
Can you talk about them?
Yeah. Well, the one that has the biggest impact, I think, over the past 3 years is the increasing of the threshold for a criminal case to be filed in court. Before, the law enforcement agents and the prosecutors did not really coordinate. So it was the responsibility of the police and the NBI to collect the evidence, build the case up, and then when they were done, bring it to the prosecutor's office for the eventual filing in court. I mean, not for anything, the law enforcement agents are good at what they do, but it's different when you have a legal mind with you telling you that, okay, these are the types of evidence we need for us to file a strong case. And it helps that from the get-go, those that have the legal expertise are already there, even at the scene of the crime. Because then evidence is gathered properly, the right witnesses are taken in, and it builds a strong case. And so now, with what we call the case build-up rule, the prosecutors and the law enforcement agents are meant to work together from the very start of the case. And that really increases the probability of convictions. And we've seen it in concrete numbers that before, when the old system was in place, criminal cases did not really fly as much as now, because now we only file cases when we're actually very sure that this person could very well be the perpetrator of a crime.
That's amazing that there wasn't coordination beforehand, but now that would make sense that you would need the coordination between the prosecutor's office and the police officers. That would just be kind of common sense. What is your percentage of prosecution versus cases that are dismissed? You guys are only handling criminal cases, right? Not civil cases.
I don't have the exact number with me now, but it went above the 90% threshold already.
So you guys are prosecuting 90% of these cases. Or you're getting a guilty conviction on 90%
of the cases.
Of the cases that you're prosecuting.
That we file in court, yes. Because we only file it in court when we have a strong case. Before, when the prosecutor would evaluate the evidence, all they would look for was probable cause. So the question the prosecutor would ask themselves, do I have enough evidence to show that this person probably committed a crime? Which is kind of low, right? Now, with the new setup, with the prosecutors now helping the law enforcement agents on the ground, we added more responsibility on the prosecutor. And now the threshold is reasonable certainty of conviction. So you have to reach that level of evidence, reasonable certainty of conviction. Am I almost certain that given the evidence that I have now, that this person will be convicted in court?
You mentioned to me earlier that you wanted, in the Philippines, you wanted people to fear a subpoena from the DOJ or from the prosecutor's office. And they didn't fear that before. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Given the conviction rates before, if you got a subpoena, it's as if you had a very long road that you could play around with. A lot could happen, but now, given the higher threshold of evidence needed, once you get that subpoena,
it's legit.
That means we have enough evidence to put you in jail.
I'll be honest, I'd be more fearful getting a subpoena here in the Philippines than I would in the US. Yeah. I would be like, oh my God, one, am I going to be tried fairly?
Yeah.
right? Will I get a fair case? And two, if I ever get thrown in jail, how the hell would I ever get out? And what are the human conditions of jail? So what was the main switch between going from cases that were more probable cause to cases that you're 90% likely to convict?
Well, one, we wanted to make sure that we only filed quality cases in court so that our dockets aren't flooded by useless cases. Before, you could really weaponize the DOJ because you could just file cases left and right, even if you didn't have enough case evidence to prove the case in court. Now, given the increase in the threshold, you only file cases that you know are going to succeed in the criminal court. Another thing, which is for me very important as well, you declog jails, because once you file cases against people and they can't pay for bail, they're left in jail for until their case is heard. And so now, if there's a flimsy case, that person will not go to jail anymore, because a lot of the times cases are filed against whoever, people who don't have much in life, right? They can't pay bail, and then they end up getting acquitted anyway in court. Why not make the screening of cases much higher or much more strict at the DOJ level? Why do they have to go to jail and then have the courts declare them not guilty or innocent? Why wait till then? So we wanted to make sure that only quality cases were filed in court so that we don't waste the lives of Filipinos.
Right. You mentioned jails. Do you feel that the system of punishment here is fair?
System of punishment.
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I remember this was a while back during Duterte, and this was his fight on drugs.
Yeah.
We all knew somebody who got arrested for dealing drugs. And him and his girlfriend got thrown into jail. They ended up being there for years without a court case.
Yeah. Well, it was a very different system back then. And, my boss actually uncovered a system that they used to live by, which was a quota system. And in a quota system, law enforcers were pretty much forced to catch drug lords, drug users, and they had to reach a certain quota, which for me, people aren't statistics.
Right.
We shouldn't be trivializing the lives of people and reducing them to mere numbers. And so what should be the standard is evidence. If there's enough evidence to catch somebody, then use the evidence, catch the person, and put them through the right judicial process, right? If we're just reducing them to mere numbers and mere quotas, it breeds this culture of abuse because the police officers are now tempted to plant drugs or to catch somebody who was not supposed to be their target just so they had a catch of the day and they could fill up their numbers. That's not everybody. Again, I don't want to generalize, but human nature will dictate that the temptation was there.
Are you guys in charge of ensuring that law enforcement is up to standard, that we have good police officers, that we are training them, that they follow a code of conduct or ethics? Are you guys the department that oversees that?
Not for the police. The police, the Philippine National Police, is under the Department of Interior and Local Government, which is a completely different department. Under the DOJ is the NBI. So if we're talking about law enforcement agents, we have under us the NBI, which is supposed to be the agency that investigates more complicated cases.
White collar crimes, for example.
Yeah.
FBI related type of stuff. Yeah.
Which is why you'll find a lot of lawyers and accountants in the NBI, so they could do a more in-depth investigation.
So when Marcos came out and talked about the flood thing, I didn't know what his angle was. I had hoped that the president is now going to speak up against corruption and going to fight against corruption. That was my hope. I didn't know if this was maybe some sort of political play at hand or what was going on, but this was my hope. If that is the case, if the government is serious about cracking down on corruption, what would the DOJ need to do? What role would we have to see from the DOJ?
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we have to be able to answer that question, you have to define the jurisdictions of certain offices. So the Department of Justice would be involved if we went up against the contractors first, because they, as ordinary citizens, would be under the jurisdiction of the DOJ. If we're talking about politicians or public officials, that would go under the jurisdiction of the ombudsman. Together, you have a holistic investigation, right? But if the president wants to go after the contractors so that the contractors would spill the beans on who they talk to in government, then you can use the DOJ first as a pressure point,
Right.
so that they could spill the beans as to who
Create a bigger case out of it.
the bigger pick.
Now, you talked about this ombudsman. Like, I don't know what that is. Is that something new? Is that a new system or government agency in the government here? Or has that always been about? Has that been there for a while?
It's been there since 1987.
Okay, tell us about this.
So the ombudsman is a constitutional commission, right, that is outside of any branch of government, which is supposed to prosecute cases of corruption and graft. So if there's any issue of corruption and graft involving public officials, then it's tried in the Sandigan Bayan by the ombudsman. So it's a mechanism that was introduced to the Philippine setup given the history of corruption that the Philippines had way back.
That sounds like something we desperately need. So it's been around since the 90s. Has it been effective?
Well, given the people who have been put in the ombudsman, I mean, not to say all of them, but certain people treated it as a retirement job. A lot of them who were put in that position were a lot more passive than was expected of them. And, it's a tough job because you're going against your fellow workers in government.
Yeah.
So you feel that tension from the get-go. But it's a necessary mechanism, in my opinion, to have somebody that is outside of the government, essentially, probing everything that's happening within.
I keep thinking of the Department of Doge with Elon Musk and what Trump was trying to do. And that was great entertainment, by the way. Just them calling out government and I was asking, how come we don't have something like that? We needed something like that. But it doesn't sound like it's been very effective. Is that going to change anytime soon?
Well, my boss is an applicant for the ombudsman, actually. And knowing him and the way he handles problems, he's going to go into the thick of things right away. This guy is somebody who...
Tell us about him.
I mean, he's a politician in his own right. He was a governor, became a congressman, but he was always independent in the way that he thought. And he had a very pioneering attitude. The reform that we had just talked about. He had been thinking of this reform since he was in law school. And now that he was appointed as Secretary of Justice, it was the first thing that he did. And he signed that order on his birthday as a birthday gift to himself. So, and even his friends were not spared. He has friends that faced certain cases, and he didn't lift a finger. He let it go through the process. And he never imposes his own will on the people that work under him. So I think that's a very good quality for an ombudsman.
So I know you're willing to talk about some of the notable cases that's going on right now, the high profile cases that's happening in the Philippines. And I must admit, I'm not fully aware of every story. I mean, I know bits and pieces of every story. And as a foreigner outside looking in, I don't get all of this stuff in English. So I get part of the story, but I get to ask you directly and how you guys are seeing the case. You're able to talk about some of these cases, correct?
Yes, as long as they're not in court.
Okay. Tell us about the most recent big case, which was this missing Sabungeros. Sabungeros. What happened there? Can you tell us anything about that?
Ever since we came in, because the case started in 2021 when people started going missing. Families would come out and say that, their relative had suddenly just disappeared. Some of them were taken from their houses. Some of them were taken from the arenas. Some of them just never came home. And so we tallied about 34 missing Sabungeros, which are cockfighting enthusiasts, people who were involved in the business, right? And every month from 2022, we would meet the families, even if we had no leads or leads went cold, just to tell them that we are not giving up on this case. And my boss, even without knowing anything, would just meet them just so we could give them some sort of hope, right? And so it led to us filing kidnapping cases where 6 people were caught and charged with kidnapping. That case is in court, so I can't really talk much about it. But what I can say is that case opened up the floodgates because one of the people who was charged in that case was one of the people who was closest to a certain group who told everything. Apparently, because the case kind of pressured him or put him in a situation where the relationship between him and his principals went sour. And so we are very proud of that development because if not for that case, the kidnapping case, he wouldn't have turned against his principals. And the kidnapping case was filed on the basis of CCTV cameras taking footages of people being dragged out of the arena, which obviously you can't call that murder yet, even if we know somewhere in our hearts and minds that these people are probably dead. But the only evidence we had was for kidnapping. And so when we filed the kidnapping case, it pushed a pressure point in that group that caused friction and somehow led to this guy giving us a tell-all. And on that basis, on the basis of the tell-all, suddenly all the cold deeds turned hot again. I'm sure you followed the investigation in Taal Lake, where several skeletons were retrieved from the bottom of the lake, right? Obviously, we don't know yet who these people are. We have to put them through DNA testing, but it lends credibility straight away on the testimony of this whistleblower, right? And so right now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to fill in all the details. Like I said, the threshold of evidence is much higher now, which puts pressure on us to make sure that we gather enough evidence, not only testimonial, but through object evidence to prove the case. Because when you have testimonial evidence, that's the word of a person. That's his or her own version. But when that person is compromised, and it's very possible that that could happen by some sort of bribe or promise, and the person turns on his own story, then you're left with nothing. But if you're able to corroborate the statement with different pieces of evidence to stand on its own, meaning even if the person changes his story, the evidence is still there to tell that same story, then you're left with a much better case, a much stronger case.
I want to ask you what your kind of thoughts and feelings about how gambling has affected this country.
It's a hot topic now, actually.
Right. And this is a prime example of this. And I told you I came to the Philippines for the online gambling industry. But back then we were handling markets like China. We would never touch the local market. And partially because you just don't want to mess with that.
Yeah.
You don't want to mess with that game here. And then they banned POGOs. And that, based on what you told me, POGOs brought in a whole set of problems, legal issues with human trafficking, things like that. So, these foreign POGO companies weren't, exactly the up and up, and they weren't exactly bringing the best people into the country as well. So that's got banned. But now, you had the rise of Sabong, online Sabong, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's just become kind of a dirty business. What are your thoughts about the online gambling industry or the POGO industry or the local PAC-core industries? How does it play into a lot of the criminal acts that you see?
Well, gambling is a form of entertainment that Filipinos love. If you look at the setup of Sabong, it's quite simple. You have two chickens fighting each other, and whoever wins gets the prize, right? You bet on meron side or the wala side, and whoever wins gets your money, right? And before, you had to go to these arenas to bet. You lift a finger or you have a gesture, and the Christos is what they call it. They match you with somebody else in the arena, and then they put your bets together. And it's transformed, like you said, during the pandemic into an online game, which is accessible to virtually anybody, even minors. And you could play e-Sabong anywhere, anytime, because it was on the GCash app, right? And that's kind of where we have to draw the line. And obviously, this is a discussion that even senators and congressmen are getting into because they're trying to find that line. And it's different for everybody, but that's where my line is. You cannot make it too accessible to the point that it destroys lives because you can play it anywhere, anytime. I mean, you have employees that are playing e-Sabong during their lunch breaks, right? They're wasting money. They're playing tens, hundreds of pesos every 2 minutes. And that's dangerous. And we've seen that. There are reports of people selling their own children to be able to get that next bet in. And these are the social ills that it comes with, right? So it's one thing to look at it as entertainment, but it's another thing when it starts to spill over to these types of situations where people get desperate, they get addicted, and you give them the accessibility to stay addicted.
Right. And we have such a problem with poverty as it is, with debt problems, and this is just going to continue to erode the fabric of society.
Exactly. So if it were up to me, actually, I would just revert back to the old brick and mortar type of gambling. Like, make it hard for people to gamble.
In Singapore, if you're a local, you have to pay $100 just to go into the casino, and that's a deterrent. Just to walk into the casino. If you're a foreigner, you walk in for free.
There you go.
I mean, that's just ways.
Yeah, and I feel like we should be putting those barriers so that we keep it as entertainment.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that. If you have to pay a fee to get into the Sabong, that would really eliminate maybe 80% of the people who would have bet.
I want to ask you about the case with Duterte and the extrajudicial killings that he was prosecuted by he's obtained by the ICC. What involvement do you guys have in that case?
Well, we did not have a real role, and I'll explain later, but we literally stood as a competent authority to determine whether the arrest was valid or not. So the prosecutor general was at the actual arrest site, which was in the airport, and attested to certain facts that were required by the ICC to determine whether the arrest was valid or not. Right. Now, this is something that I wish to clear up, right? It states in the rule that you need a judicial authority, a competent judicial authority. And when you say judicial, you automatically think of the courts, right? And when we saw that initially, obviously, that's what we thought of. Competent judicial authority. But it came to light.
Who was the judicial authority on that?
In that case,
in
the
that
prosecutor
case.
General.
In what country? Was it here?
Here,
okay.
Yes. And we did that. We put him there as the competent authority because it came to our attention that in other jurisdictions, the prosecutor was also considered that. So if that were to be interpreted by a Filipino in the local setting, there's no way that the prosecutor general could become the competent judicial authority. No way. But because it's clear, judicial means the courts, and we're the executive branch, right? However, because there was precedent that the prosecutor stood as the competent authority, we used that as the basis of sending the prosecutor general. And at the same time, the person who, or the body that would interpret ultimately the validity of, or who determined the validity of the arrest, given that the prosecutor general stood as the competent judicial authority, is not us. It's the ICC. Okay. So if the ICC already acknowledged before that a prosecutor could stand in the place of the competent judicial authority, then who are we to question that as well if they themselves, who wrote the rules, accepted that interpretation in another case? So that was our role in the arrest.
Was there anything else that you needed to make the arrest valid? Was it just that?
It was just that. Obviously, his other rights had to be respected as well.
So in the case of, I don't know if you can speak about that, but obviously Duterte gets detained by the ICC. Sarah Duterte is going through impeachment. Are you guys involved in that at
Not
all?
in that process.
You talk about this at all?
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court came out with a decision rendering unconstitutional the impeachment process that had been undergone by Congress and Senate. And there's a lot of reactions to that Supreme Court decision. A lot of people say it's an overreach. Other people say it's sound. So you have competing jurisdictions, or sorry, competing arguments on both sides. But now that there is a motion for reconsideration pending with the Supreme Court, again, we leave it up to the Supreme Court to either affirm their initial decision or overturn it.
Okay.
Right? And at the end of the day, this is a political process. So when the Congress decides to impeach an impeachable officer like the vice president and sends it to the the Senate now convenes as a trial court. So they become judges. So they suddenly their responsibilities are twofold. One, as legislators who pass laws on a daily basis. But now, since there is an impeachment case filed with them, they suddenly become a court as well.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, these are all politicians. Not all of them are lawyers. And so it's still very highly politically charged. And so it has a lot to do with public perception still. And so if you look at the popularity of the Dutertes, there's still a force to reckon with. They still have the popularity in the Visayas and Mindanao especially. And so a lot of these politicians will obviously have to consider that as part of their decision because they too have political interest in the case. It's not just the fate of the person being impeached, but it's also the political interest of the people who are supposed to be judges. But that's how it's designed. Right? That's how it's designed. It's we in the legal profession know that it is a political process. And so yes, the rules of the court may apply, but at the end of the day, it's being decided by people who are politicians and public servants, first and foremost.
Now, the other case I wanted to ask you about is the Alice Go case and the infiltration of the Chinese. How do you guys look at this? I mean, are you guys involved with this? How are you guys doing? You guys the ones behind the investigation of this?
Yes, at the very center of it, actually.
Okay.
We were very central to her coming back home and charging her with qualified human trafficking. It started off actually as a raid that we did in coordination with the PNP, the NBI, the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission, and we raided this place in Bamban, Laguna, Tarlac, yeah.
You're raiding a operations basically.
We were
in illegal operations basically.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
For gambling. Okay.
This is for gambling, but POGOs were legal.
Yeah.
Up until they weren't, right? But at that time, it was legal. What was illegal were the things that they were doing outside of the gambling operations,
Such as
scamming, trafficking, corruption. All of these tied into that whole situation there in Bamban, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the initial basis of our raid. And then we found out that hey, these are the cars of the mayor, and that's the first time that we had an inkling maybe she's involved, and that opened up the floodgates, really. Yeah. And then we found out that she faked her birth certificate, that she wasn't actually Filipino, and that she was a mayor at that. You know what I mean? So it was really it had every making of a sensational case.
Wow. Yeah. And how insidious was that? The Chinese coming into for POGO or whatever, the Chinese coming into the Philippines and infiltrating systems and faking birth certificates and even running for political office. How much of that did you be able to uncover?
Well, initially, it was funny because we thought that she was a Chinese spy. So we thought, hey, this girl is trying to pull a fast one on the Philippine government, like infiltrating government offices for their own personal gain. But then, it was debunked very soon after that, she had been here, she had lived here for so long, and then they got into that business because they were entrepreneurs. And then from there, she entered into politics to protect the type of business. So yeah, it was a crazy time for us, man. Like, we were all over media talking about this case. There was so much interest, not only locally, but globally. There were so many different angles, but you really just have to stick to the facts. And at the end of the day, we want to get her on the crime of human trafficking, which is the worst thing that you could do here in the Philippines, given the very strong response the government, under the leadership of the president, wants to take against this transnational crime, really.
Mico, it's honestly so easy to shit on all the problems in the Philippines. I mean, it's so easy to talk about them. But what's really hard is talking about real practical solutions. Mm-hmm. If I were to say, Mico, you have a magic wand. You can make 3 changes in your department to affect the most change in a positive direction. What would they be?
I would say, first of all, to increase the salaries of government officials and government employees. I mean, you have to let them feel that they're a part of something bigger than themselves. And you have to give them the dignity to be with their peers and be able to say that you and I are quite equal.
Right.
That, I think, will really boost the morale of a lot of people in government and lead them to the right direction and not be tempted to do anything that would jeopardize their public service.
Singapore is an example. Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore, they really believe in setting up government officials to be the smartest and the most well-paid. I don't know if they're the most well-paid, but they're paid very well, and they want to attract the smartest people in the country.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I mean, it's not a quick fix because obviously you need a lot of money for that because there are thousands of government employees, and any increase would really have a huge allocation needed. But if I had a magic wand, obviously that's one of the first things I would do, just to increase efficiency in government and for us to be able to attract smarter, more skilled people who otherwise would go abroad or work in the private sector. Why not government? I mean, this is a very fulfilling position to be in. It's just that it's not given the importance in terms of salary. Second, I would say for government to be able to work in a silo without the effect of social media or without the influence of social media. A lot of government officials, including myself, I'm guilty of this. We react to social media way too often.
So they're listening to social media. They are listening to what people are saying.
Oh, absolutely. Anyone who says that they're not is, and I say that,
right.
yeah, it definitely affects the way government works sometimes. If not from traditional news, if not from actual posts, from the comments, even people want to know what people are talking about.
But at least, we feel like they're listening. At the very least, they're listening. So that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are so many things that aren't on the news that should still be happening behind the scenes that cannot be, you can't afford to distract people from. But instead, resources and a lot of time and effort is being put into things that are being highlighted in social media because they wanna combat a certain notion.
So something goes viral.
Yeah.
Right? And then all of a sudden that agenda becomes the top agenda priority for a politician. Can you give us an example?
Well, the significant cases that we just talked about. I mean, there are other cases of similar nature, maybe not as interesting to media, but just as important in terms of maintaining peace and order in the country. So if we're talking about sensational cases, yes, they're sensational for a reason, but then I really think it shouldn't distract public officials from doing their daily work. The third one would probably be to make institutions more systems-driven rather than person-driven or personality-driven. Systems and institutions are supposed to work regardless of who is in there. That's how you know an institution is strong, because no matter who you put in and who you take out, the system is supposed to run the same way. And so when things start to become personality-based, that's where all these human interventions come into place, all these temptations for corruption and making shortcuts. That's, I think, where it all stems from.
I also have one I wanted to ask you as a foreigner. And I have a hard time with this because, I made my money here in back in the days here in this country. And I've always struggled with being able to invest in this country. I don't feel like it's inclusive for me.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you guys are working on enforcement-wise or systems-wise to assure that both local and foreigners have equal rights and are protected?
Well, obviously, it will never reach a point where it'll be equal rights because there are definitely more rights afforded to locals than there are to, and that happens everywhere, right? But when you talk about contracts and you talk about entering into business, then the playing field should be equal. So obviously the certainty of the contract being fulfilled. And if ever it is not, the certainty of punishment for those who violate the law. That's something that I feel should be afforded to anybody, regardless of whether you're a Filipino or a foreign investor. If somebody violates the law, violates the contract, there should be predictable results and people should be held accountable consistently.
Is there anything you can change in the system that makes that more fair for either foreigners or locals?
Well, if the systems worked properly and it wasn't personality driven, then I think it would really level out the playing field. It's just that now, like what we talked about at the start of the podcast, that there are familial ties. There's that kababayan thing where if you and I are Filipinos and we're against a certain foreigner, we have to, we can talk, but you can't talk to him. You know what I mean? So as long as we're able to address that culturally and systemically, then it will even out the playing field. Because if you look at the law, it does afford equal rights to both foreigners and Filipinos, except maybe the capacity to own land, which is constitutional. But in terms of commercial contracts, it's supposed to be the same.
It's supposed to be, yeah. Now, we talked a little bit about how we're living in an interesting time, especially for politicians now, with social media, with AI, with technology. How do you see the system, the justice system, using these type of technologies and tools to its advantages? Because I can think already, like if I were to look at the BIR, for example, like if you want to automate audits, you could totally use AI.
Yeah.
If you had access to data, what are you guys thinking in terms of what power do you have in your fingertips using technology?
Well, there's definitely a lot you can do with technology in terms of efficiency and in terms of decision making. Because, well, for one, efficiency, let's say in the Bureau of Corrections. Did you know that when we first came in, there were people who were in jail who weren't supposed to be there anymore, meaning they had already served their sentence and yet they were still in jail. And that is the height of human rights violations. You know what I mean? Because any additional day you spend in jail is a violation of your rights every second of that day.
Oh, and that's my biggest fear about being thrown in jail in the Philippines.
It's better now because by the simple way of encoding all the records in one system, then you're able to see how many days the person has left in his sentence. Before, it was all manual, all records. And that's why people forget, because it's all paper. No one's there there's no ping or there's no notification to say that, okay, this guy's term is ending in a few days. Prepare his papers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But now, by the simple way of encoding everything, we call it the Carpeta system. Now we're able to let the prisoners know that, okay, you're out in a few days. Prepare.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's one of the biggest reforms we've made. And it's simple, but it's a big reform.
What's the worst case you've heard of a prisoner staying in for how long before they were released?
I plead the fifth.
Man, I bet you there are some horror stories there.
But that was before we entered. And then, for example, immigration, that's the national border. And so it's very important that you're able to know who's coming in and who's going out. And the system that you use at the border should be able to tie in with law enforcement.
Absolutely.
So the tech has to be able to really solidify that.
Let someone fly out if they're under suspicion of a murder, for example.
And people coming in, what if they're child molesters? In a lot of countries, they have a list of child offenders. You know what I mean?
There's
sex offenders.
Huge hotbed of that happening here in the Philippines is sex offenders coming here because they can get away with everything. They can get away with so much.
But if we are able to get that background at the very border and as a result disallow their entry to the Philippines, that would be saving children on a daily basis.
So your land registry authority is under you guys. Okay. Now, I've heard of stories of land titles being washed away through floods.
Yeah.
And they've been talking about digitizing land titles forever. And still to this day, when you ask the LRA, they say it's 90% complete. It's been 90% complete for the last decade, right?
Yeah.
And so I often wonder if they really do want to digitize titles. But it's so important. right? You guys, I don't know why the DOJ exactly is on top of the Land Registry Authority, but like you said, it's a legal process that has to happen. There's certain levels of due diligence, and maybe that's why you guys are on. Well, how do you see using technology to fix that part of it?
Well, LRA, it's funny how you say that it's always been 90% ready. The 10% there, if I were to guess, is the resistance of people who take advantage of the situation.
Probably.
Right? I mean, it's easy to digitalize the land titling system by way of implementing a blockchain type of technology. Because with blockchain technology, everybody that uses the system can see exactly the step-by-step process where
it's a public ledger.
It's a public ledger. So if you have title A pass from person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's going to be there forever, right? And there's no way that you can amend that or change that by simply deleting something on a computer. Because it's a public ledger. Everybody has access to it and everybody is involved and has a stake in keeping the integrity of that ledger.
So what are the chances of the LRA actually being able to implement anything like that? I mean, how realistic is this? They haven't even digitized paper titles.
You really need the political will.
Is there no political will for this? If I take a step back and using my perceptions or misperceptions, my thinking is the political will isn't there because how many people's title or assets are parked under real estate at the moment? Maybe there isn't a desire for that transparency to be there. Maybe that's the problem with the...
Yeah. There's a lot of resistance, especially because the DOJ has a chief technological officer. He's the only non-lawyer in the DOJ that has a similar position as I do, an assistant secretary. And his sole purpose is to digitalize all the agencies. And he's been pushing a lot, but he doesn't even know where the resistance is coming from. For some reason, he just can't get anything done. I mean, no, sorry. He's had some success. Right, he's been able to consolidate all the systems being used in the LRA currently, but there are some rogue elements from either the inside or the outside that don't want this to succeed.
Yes,
and so he encounters challenges everywhere.
It makes a lot of sense because with a system like that, you can actually, let's use the US or Japan, for example. Property values are determined by actual sales price, right? Based on data. If you had that system, for example, you can now determine the real actual market value of properties instead of it being pushed by the developers. Developers say, well, we sold the last property at 400,000 per square feet or square meter. So therefore, all prices are at 400,000 per square meters. And this happens in Davao. This happens in Cebu. Valuation is pushed by the most recent sales, right? Yeah. And so you have that incentive, but then you also have all the other incentives behind, we were like I was mentioning to you before, I had an interesting podcast with David Lee Chu. And he said at some point back in the 80s, back in the 70s and 80s, if you made any kind of money, there was a flight of capital. And that money would go to a Swiss bank account or a US bank account or somewhere overseas. So money was being fleeing the country. And at some point, there was AML rules that prevented money to easily cross borders that way without the proper KYC, et cetera. And since then, real estate has been on a complete tear. It's been on a 20-year bull run, which is counter-cyclical for any real estate market anywhere in the world, because in any real estate market, you used to go through ups and downs. In this particular case, it was going up without justification for the market. And the way you tell is market rents are the justification of valuation, because you can't fudge the market rent. Right. So in the case of the Philippines, you saw property values rose for the last 20 years without the increase in rent. So that means a lot of people it implies that a lot of money was going into real estate and properties were just sitting empty. And this kept happening because there's just this people were just moving, all that liquidity in the market will go into real estate. And that is my guess of where the resistance may be coming from. What do you think about that? Do you think that's realistic?
That is realistic. I think it could be one of the factors as well. But that goes into the whole economics of real estate and this and that. It could also be as short-sighted as there are syndicates out there who can abuse the system and get fake titles, and
That's true too. Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It could range.
That's
because-
true. If you're faking a bunch of land titles
Yeah.
and it's being
and then
upheld,
claiming them
Yeah.
in court, it could be that short-sighted and that, how would you say in English? Because in Tagalog you say, "Mhm." 'Cause
yeah.
in Tagalog you would say garapal. It's like thick-faced. You're not ashamed to
Right.
get, to do such shortcuts. Yeah.
Okay, Mico, I'm going to wrap this up with one last question
Okay.
for you. Let's just assume the DOJ is corruptible. How then do we ensure that the DOJ leads the fight of corruption effectively? What systems, what changes, or what policies need to be in place?
It's hard to assume that the DOJ is corruptible, because if the DOJ is corruptible, then it cascades down to
I'm not saying
every
it is, but
Yeah.
let's just assume that, over time, it may lose its integrity somewhere,
aspect. Mhm.
right? So then how then do you make sure that, regardless of whoever's in charge,
Mhm.
whether the person in charge is corruptible or
Yeah.
not, that we maintain that level of integrity of the mission?
I think the mechanisms in place for anti-corruption should be strengthened. The ombudsman is an office that, well, I mentioned a while ago, but it's very central to the fight against corruption in this country. And for us to be able to utilize that office and make sure that, the people in the ombudsman and the people are supposed to investigate corruption are the ones that are incorruptible, because any government agency will be under the jurisdiction of the ombudsman. And so if we're assuming that the DOJ is corruptible, you need a third party to be able to probe them and to
Yeah.
investigate and put them in jail.
Right.
Right? Again, like I also mentioned a while ago, instead of being personality driven, which is also a premise in your statement that the DOJ is corruptible, because you can't corrupt an institution, you can corrupt people in the institution.
Right.
Right. So instead of being personality driven, we have to make things system driven and to allow for less human intervention in things that don't need human intervention. Obviously, there will always have to be human intervention in some of these processes, like the court system. You cannot completely turn into AI the decision-making powers of judges,
Court.
because the judges have to be in touch with the times. So decisions sometimes are swayed by the circumstances that surround them at a certain time. But a lot of the things, especially processes that are supposed to be ministerial, they should be the first things to go and to be digitalized. Perhaps if AI is appropriate, to institute also some reforms in AI. But at the end of the day, it's really the political will to keep the government going.
Now, if our audience or any audience out there wants to follow the DOJ and your communications, where do they follow you guys? Where do they get in touch with you?
Okay, so we have the Department of Justice Action Center. This is a way for us to bring the justice system closer to the public. We also have, obviously, we have press conferences and statements that we release. But obviously, this is a better way to communicate when we're talking real talk, right? A lot of the times, people find that press statements and press conferences are too sanitized. And so it pays off to have this type of conversation that's relaxed and quite,
And now they can get to know you guys
Yes.
as a personality. They get to know what you guys are about and what you stand for.
Yeah.
And that's great. So would love to ask you guys to like and subscribe. And if you like this type of content, we would be happy to produce more of this. Please share with us what your thoughts about this, what type of things you would like to hear, and what type of conversations you would like us to have with whom. Please like and share, and see you in the next podcast. And thank you so much, Mico, for joining us. It was a great talk, and we'd love to have you back again.
Yeah, man. I feel like we barely scratched the surface on this
man.
one.
Oh man, we can go so deep on this. Thank you, Mico.
Hi, man.